Think about all of the colonies we've discussed so far. The French in New France, the Dutch in New Netherland, the English in New England. Noticing a pattern? They may have had a lack of creative names in common, but the English colonies developed very differently from one another. Jamestown started out as a charter colony, while Plymouth started out as religious safe havens for pilgrims, and, as you may remember, the English colony of New York actually started out as a Dutch colony. And as we explore more of Great Britain's colonies today, it's important to remember that where we ended up was far from guaranteed or preordained. The huge empire England ended up with wasn't always so obvious. Remember that England wasn't even the first European power to set foot in North America. Instead, England's rise as an empire came about because of many different decisions made by many different people. So today, let's talk about those decisions and some of their consequences. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall U.S. History to 1865. If you ask George, an Englishman living in London during the late 17th century, which colony was the most valuable, you might be surprised by the answer. It wouldn't have been New York, or even Massachusetts or Plymouth. That's because, as tasty as lobster rolls are, they have nothing on the sweet, sweet taste of sugarcane. The English loved sugar. In 1700, the average person living in England consumed about 4 pounds of sugar yearly, which is a rookie number by today's standards. But by 1730, that number tripled. And that was before soda pop and candy bars. Can you imagine if George had gotten his hands on a Snickers? It might actually knock him off his feet. And so if you asked George which colony was the most important to England, he'd probably point to a map of the Caribbean, where modern-day Barbados, Jamaica, and a string of other islands could be found. George knew this region as the West Indies. So let's take a closer look at these colonies that would give Hershey, Pennsylvania a run for its money. The British West Indies were a string of colonies located in the Caribbean. It included islands like the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, among others. But colonizing the Caribbean wasn't always inevitable. That's because for a long time, European nations made more money supporting pirates than colonizing the region, and there were lots and lots of pirates of the Caribbean. See what I did there? Anyway, the Caribbean was a hotbed of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. During this time, famous pirates like William Kidd, Stede Bonnet, Henry Morgan, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, and Mary Read all raided the West Indies. And for a while, Europe was totally cool with that, because pirates could also act as privateers. Basically, they were given permission by one country to attack and raid the ships of another country. But by the early 18th century, pirates were actually hurting European business coming in and out of Caribbean ports. That yo-ho-ho lifestyle was getting a bit out of hand. It's almost like trusting criminals to do your dirty work is a bad idea. In 1717, the British Parliament cracked down by passing the Transportation Acts. As a result, around 600 pirates were executed by the British between 1716 and 1726. The biggest reason the golden age of piracy ended? Barbados, aka one of the most important colonies in the West Indies. The first English ships docked in Barbados in 1625. 25 years later, over 40,000 people, including settlers, natives, and forced laborers, were living on the tiny island. But if you're not sure if that number is a lot, only about 21,000 people lived in all of New England at that same time. But what made Barbados so important? Like any decent realtor will tell you, it's all about location, location, location. English settlers loved that Barbados was on the outer edge of the West Indies. This meant that the island didn't receive as much military action. And at the beginning, Barbados was home to some small-scale agriculture and farming. Then sugar happened. Hundreds of acres of sugar plantations started springing up around 1645. So much of the land was dedicated to sugar production that the island had to basically import everything else to stay alive, including food. So New England, with its comparatively small population, actually supplied Barbados with wheat and other resources. And thanks to England's sweet tooth, sugar growing took off in Barbados. But this had significant consequences that extended well beyond the tiny island's four corners. See, sugar is a difficult plant to cultivate, meaning a significant amount of labor was suddenly needed in the Caribbean. At first, indentured servants and convicts were brought to Barbados, but eventually the English decided to rely on enslaved Africans. African enslavement developed for several reasons, but they all boiled down to one thing: racial hierarchy. As the number of white indentured servants dropped, a greater correlation between skin color and labor developed. African enslavement increased, and being part of forced labor was seen as beneath white workers. By 1680, the average plantation in Barbados had around 60 enslaved persons, and the island's population was majority enslaved. Soon, a wealthy elite class came to dominate the island, but their influence extended to Britain as well. Those in England were far more welcoming of Barbadian planters than, say, Virginian tobacco growers. As a result, sugar not only loomed large in English diets, but in the English Parliament as well. The sugar lobby was real. And since sugar was so profitable, you can imagine that the island's planter elite treated the land very carefully so as not to overwork it. I'm just kidding, they absolutely destroyed that land. Overproduction on Barbados forced English plantation owners to look elsewhere to keep their business model afloat in the Caribbean. And while some smaller settlements developed in Antigua and St. Kitts, the next major Caribbean settlement was Jamaica. For a while, Jamaica was a lot like the rest of the Caribbean. Pirates ruled the seas, drank loads of rum, and soaked up the Jamaican sun at Port Royal in between violent raids. Pirates were so important to the island that in 1674, famed pirate Henry Morgan was named English Deputy Governor of Jamaica. But then, on June 7, 1692, a massive earthquake struck the island and half of Port Royal went sliding into the ocean. Some took the earthquake as God's divine judgment against pirates. Divine intervention or not, a half-destroyed Port Royal was of little use to the English. As a result, a new port, Kingston, became the center of the Jamaican economy. And just in case it was God's wrath behind the earthquake, the English decided to dedicate the island fully to sugar production. And what do you know? Wealthy sugar planters showed up, bringing more enslaved Africans to work the fields. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were brought to the island, and that enslaved population outnumbered whites 3-1. And because Jamaica is much larger than Barbados, it produced way more sugar. By the start of the 18th century, Jamaica was the largest sugar exporter in the West Indies and the most important English colony in the Caribbean. But English expansion wasn't limited to the Caribbean. Pretty soon, English settlers looked further north to a little slice of heaven protected by a chain of beautiful barrier islands. Good old Carolina. Carolina was named after English monarch Charles II, and if that wasn't enough, the colony's largest city, Charlestown, was also founded in 1670 and named in honor of the king. Carolina was partially an expansion of the planter society in the Caribbean, but also an important buffer colony. The English wanted a colony set up between the Spanish settlements in Florida and the other English colonies in Virginia and New England. And Spain did its best to turn Carolina into a Spanish colony, attacking Edisto Island in 1686. But a hurricane wiped out the Spanish force before it could move further north to Charlestown. At first, Carolina was massive. It extended all the way south into present-day Daytona Beach, Florida, and north up to Virginia's southern border. But just like the Puritans and Pilgrims in New England, the English colonists in Carolina didn't settle in some untamed wilderness. Native Americans lived in and dominated the region. And English settlers quickly found their place in native trade systems. For instance, the English traded firearms to the natives in exchange for deerskins. Then they began to trade the natives themselves. A serious Native American slave trade existed in the Southeast that the English were all too happy to contribute to. The slave trade came to a head in 1715 when war broke out between the Yamasee tribe and the Carolinian settlers living in the Carolina interior. As a result, the colony's interior was devastated, with many English settlers fleeing for Charlestown. And while sugar was the main crop in the Caribbean, another staple reigned supreme in Carolina: rice. Rice, and later indigo, were huge moneymakers for Carolina. In fact, rice was even more profitable than the tobacco grown further north in the Chesapeake. South Carolina quickly started to look like the West Indies. The plantation owners simply shifted their operation to rice, but continued to heavily rely on enslaved African labor. And stop me if you heard this one already, but South Carolina also had a majority enslaved population. Further south, another colony was taking shape. In the 1730s, Carolinian planters established Georgia, but Georgia wasn't supposed to look like Carolina or even the West Indies. Georgia was a prison colony, meaning those who faced punishment in England could be sent to Georgia to endure hard labor instead of life in an English prison. The idea was to provide an alternative to jailing people in severe debt, as many believed that hard work in the colonies would cure the poor of their perceived laziness. Slavery was explicitly rejected and smaller land holdings were created. Unfortunately, slavery was already too ingrained economically and culturally. By the mid-18th century, part of being English meant having certain fundamental rights. These rights included the right to own slaves. So in Georgia, the rejection of slavery was seen as a rejection of a fundamental right. In 1751, slavery was accepted in Georgia and the colony went the way of Barbados, Jamaica, and Carolina. Enslaved people resisted their enslavement in all kinds of ways. Enslavers feared rebellions, disobedience, individual acts of retribution, so they created a series of slave codes that prevented slaves from reading and writing, traveling freely, and using guns. But enslaved people found more ways to resist. One of the most common ways? Running away. These escaped enslaved people formed their own independent communities called Maroon communities. Two of the most prominent Maroon communities were in Brazil and Jamaica. The Brazilian Maroon community reportedly had 20,000 inhabitants, and in Jamaica, Maroon communities often raided settlements and were pretty dang good at it. In fact, the English government even negotiated a treaty with one Jamaican Maroon community, granting independence to the community in exchange for an end to the raids. To this day, some people still live in former Maroon towns in Jamaica. Running away wasn't the only form of resistance. Those who stayed rebelled by breaking tools and causing work stoppages. Some enslaved people even revolted. If we look back to slavery in West Africa, we learn that many enslaved people were prisoners of war, captured and then sold to European slave traders. Those prisoners of war were often military leaders who used their knowledge of war to launch slave revolts in the English colonies. For example, an enslaved former African chieftain named Tacky led one of the largest slave rebellions in history in Jamaica in the 1760s. But the biggest reaction to slavery was simply survival. Chattel slavery meant African laborers were nothing more than property to their enslavers. So enslaved persons maintained their humanity by building communities and their own kinship networks like they had in West Africa. By the 17th and 18th centuries, England became a major imperial power in the Atlantic by establishing colonies in the Caribbean and southeastern United States. But this rise came on the back of cruel and violent systems of slavery. It followed the English across the Caribbean Sea and up the Atlantic into Carolina and Georgia. Slavery wasn't just some preordained fact, just like English dominance in the Atlantic was far from a sure thing. In fact, if you crash landed in the Caribbean at the start of the 17th century, you might think the Dutch or Spanish would become the dominant power in the region. After all, both had settlements in the Caribbean long before the English. Instead, both slavery and English dominance were the result of conscious decisions made by individuals living at the time. And enslaved persons found their own ways of resistance to slavery. Some ran away, some fought, but all worked hard towards one goal: maintaining their humanity. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU at the links in the description. See you next time.